Mr. President, are you deploying the additional troops to the region for deterrence or to optimize your operational capabilities?
But we have a lot of troops. We have unlimited ammunition. We have the greatest equipment in the world, and we are decimating.
The order came down at 0300 hours. Bring 20,000 troops to full combat readiness. No debate, no delay, just movement. Across every military installation in the country, the machinery of war began turning. Lights flickered on inside barracks. Boots hit concrete floors. NCOs barked orders down hallways. Soldiers who had been sleeping minutes before were now pulling on uniforms, checking gear, and dragging rucksacks out from under their bunks. These weren't light packs. Every soldier carried changes of clothing sealed in waterproof bags, hygiene kits, field dressings, and trauma supplies, high-calorie rations built for days of sustained operation. And whatever personal essentials they learned over years of deployment to never leave behind. The weight on every back was significant. Nobody complained. This was the job. Outside, a steady line of transport trucks idled along the staging areas. Exhaust curled into the cold night air. Soldiers formed up, loaded their gear onto the truck beds, and climbed aboard. Word had filtered down through the ranks. They were heading to the Middle East. For how long, nobody could say with certainty. That uncertainty was familiar. Soldiers understood it. You packed for everything because nobody ever told you exactly what was coming. While the conventional forces were assembling on the ground, something else was already in motion in the air. The paratroopers had been moving for hours. These men and women were a different kind of soldier, trained to arrive before everyone else, to descend from the sky into darkness and chaos, to function effectively before any support structure existed on the ground. They had already gone through the deliberate, methodical process of rigging their equipment. Main parachutes were packed and mounted on their backs, the canopies folded tight inside their deployment packs. Reserve parachutes were strapped across their chests. The backup for the backup, the last line between a malfunction and the ground. Weapons were broken down and secured in soft rifle cases, some carried in gloved hands, others slung across shoulders already heavy with combat packs. They moved in 2 columns across the tarmac, disciplined, quiet, purposeful. Ahead of them on the taxiway sat the C-17 Globemaster III, a massive gray 4-engined aircraft with its rear cargo ramp lowered flat to the ground like a waiting mouth. The interior lighting cast a dim red glow through the troop compartment. Jumpmasters stood at their positions. The paratroopers filed up the ramp, found their seats along the aircraft's fuselage walls, and strapped in. The ramp closed, the engines spooled up, the aircraft moved. The paratroopers would arrive first. They would be on the ground, weapons ready, and positions established before the bulk of the conventional forces had even touched down at an airfield. On a separate installation, far from the movement of troops, something different and far more deliberate kind of preparation was underway. The B-52HS Stratofortress sat on the flight line like something from another era, and in many ways it was. First flown in the 1950s, continuously upgraded, still among the most capable heavy bombers in the world. Its 8 turbofan engines hung beneath massive swept wings. Its fuselage was long and dark and utilitarian. Tonight, it was being armed. Ground crews worked methodically in the artificial light. The weapons being loaded were the Mark 84, 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs. Each one ran nearly 13 feet in length and over 1.5 feet in diameter. They were not subtle instruments. They existed for one purpose: to destroy hardened targets deep inside denied territory. Tonight, that target was inside Iran. Forklifts and specialized bomb-loading equipment moved the munitions across the tarmac one at a time. The internal rotary launcher inside the bomb bay was loaded first, multiple weapons positioned with mechanical precision on the spinning rack designed to release them in sequence. Then, the external pylons under the wings were addressed. Each bomb was lifted into position, the mounting hooks aligned and locked, the arming wires connected and verified, the safety mechanisms checked twice. Every connection point was inspected before the crew moved to the next weapon. Speed mattered, but errors here were catastrophic. The work was thorough. Inside the crew room, the B-52 flight crew was going through their own pre-mission routine. Oxygen masks were fitted, tight, and tested. The regulators were checked and rechecked. At cruise altitude, the outside air was unbreathable. A failure in the oxygen system wasn't an inconvenience, it was mission-ending at best, lethal at worst. The crew didn't move past this step until every system checked out. Personal bags were packed with the discipline of people who had done this many times. Water, high-energy snacks, printed charts and approach plates, laminated checklists, spare gloves for the cold that would seep into the cockpit at altitude despite all the insulation. Anything that might be needed across 12 or more hours of continuous flight. The mission timeline was long, the flight to the target was long. Everything had to be with them because nothing could be retrieved once the wheels left the ground. When the word came that the aircraft was fully loaded and ready, the crew walked out together across the tarmac. Bags were stowed in the cramped crew compartments, flight publications were secured, mission planning materials were organized for quick reference, survival kits were positioned where they could be reached in an emergency. The pilots climbed the ladder to the upper deck and settled into their ejection seats. The instruments glowed, systems were initialized. Below them, in the lower crew compartment, the electronic warfare officer and the radar navigator took their positions. These two crew members would be responsible for the aircraft's navigation systems, radar, sensor suite, electronic countermeasures, and the management of the weapons systems throughout the entire flight. Their compartment was small, packed with equipment, and completely without windows. They would ride through the night in the glow of their screens, doing the technical work that would make everything the pilots did possible. The 8 engines started one by one. The sound was unmistakable, a low, resonant turbine whine that built steadily as each engine came online. The aircraft began its taxi to the runway. It lined up, it rolled. Heavily loaded, it used nearly the full length of available runway before the gear broke ground, and it climbed slowly, deliberately, into the dark sky, hauling its bomb load toward a target that was still hours away. At sea, aboard an aircraft carrier somewhere in the region, a different kind of departure was taking shape. Marines stood on the hangar deck, gear at their feet, waiting for the word. Their ride was a Sikorsky CH-53E Super Stallion, one of the heaviest lift helicopters in the American military inventory, capable of carrying dozens of troops and tons of cargo. It was parked on the flight deck above, with its massive rotor blades folded back along the fuselage to save space in the tight environment of a carrier deck. These Marines were tasked with linking up with units already establishing a forward operating camp near the Iranian border. Speed was essential. The camp needed bodies, and it needed them now. The call came. Marines grabbed their gear and moved. Up the ladderways, through hatches, out onto the flight deck and into the open air and the smell of jet exhaust and salt water. The Super Stallion's rotor blades were unfolding and locking into place. The engines were turning. The sound was enormous. They loaded through the aft ramp, dropped into their canvas seats along the fuselage walls and strapped in. The ramp closed behind the last Marine. The helicopter lifted off the deck and nosed forward, climbing away from the carrier and heading inland. across Allied airfields throughout the region. Sikorsky UH-900 Black Hawk helicopters were doing their own constant work. They flew in pairs and in loose groups, moving soldiers from staging bases to forward positions closer to the border. The missions were short: land, unload, take off, return, pick up the next group, repeat. Over and over, the Black Hawks shuttled personnel into their positions with the relentless efficiency of a system that had been built and refined over decades of operational use. The pilots flew in low light, using night vision, keeping noise discipline and altitude discipline, working the airspace with the coordination of units that had trained together. High above, the C-17 carrying the paratroopers reached the designated drop zone. The crew in the cockpit transmitted the altitude to the troop compartment. The red light had been on for miles. Now it changed. Jumpmasters at both doors gave the commands in sequence, commands every paratrooper in the aircraft had heard dozens of times in training and combat. Get ready. Outboard personnel, stand up. Inboard personnel, stand up. Hook up. Check static lines. Check equipment. Sound off for equipment check. The acknowledgements ran from the back of the stick to the front, each trooper checking the gear of the soldier ahead. When the last soldier in line cleared his hookup, the jumpmaster's hand went up. The green light came on. They went out the door. One by one, then faster, a continuous stream, paratroopers exited the aircraft into the cold darkness. Static lines snapped taut, deployment bags stripped, canopies blossoming open against the dark sky and a long, irregular trail behind the moving aircraft. Below, the drop zone was open ground, dimly visible under ambient light. Within minutes, every trooper was down. Parachutes were collapsed and gathered. Weapons were pulled from their cases and made ready. Soldiers oriented themselves and began moving to the rally point by memory and by instinct, the way they'd rehearsed it. Within the first 15 minutes on the ground, the unit was organized. Weapons were up and movement was underway. Meanwhile, the same C-17 that had delivered the paratroopers continued on its flight path and descended toward an Allied airfield. The rear ramp came down while crews waited on the tarmac. Vehicles belonging to the unit's support element were driven off the ramp. Trucks, trailers, communication equipment, logistics assets. The ramp